Hello everybody, my name is Marissa and I'm going to begin by giving a bit of background information on our group project. Personal space obviously is a very valuable and tangible to many people. For this reason, people tend to respect others' personal space with an expectation of the gesture in kind. There are times when people have their personal space invaded, but who is invaded obviously depends on a number of different factors. Even though a person's race is associated with if their personal space will be invaded or not, gender appears to be the more significant factor. Next, we will cover race. It does make sense that race would play a part in whether or not personal space is invaded for some people, because of the history of discrimination and prejudice. Gerasi reported that blacks were more likely to have their personal space invaded than the white individual was. In the event that people conversing were interracial and the space between them was not penetrated, people tended to go around the white individual. So it stands to reason there are differences between when other, not all female groups of black people and all male groups of black people would be penetrated equally. Next on the agenda is gender. Just as race is an important factor in determining when people choose to violate personal space, gender also is a factor. When faced with penetrating personal space or maneuvering around a group, people do tend to assess the situation. Personal beliefs dictate the conclusions they draw about the groups they see interacting, and thusly personal beliefs dictate when a person invades personal space. Again, according to Gerasi, preconceived notions about men and women impact the rate in which male groups versus female groups are penetrated. There does seem to be some tendency to assume males have conversations in public that are trivial in comparison to those had by females in public. There is also a self-imposed stigma men have about the way they interact with one another in personal space. Next, we will cover appearance. A large part of the decision to penetrate personal space comes from how penetrable the group appears to be. It could be that the groups themselves determine whether or not they are penetrated. So, for example, the self-imposed stigma males have about interacting with other men in public causes them to consciously or subconsciously leave more space among themselves. For this reason, they appear to be much more penetrable than groups of women or even a male-female couple. Women, on the other hand, they often are much more personable and touchy. They give off an appearance of intimacy that others are less likely to penetrate. The last thing that I will cover is purpose. The purpose of our experiment was to determine how much of a role gender plays in the penetration of personal space. This is useful culturally as a study of how the genders relate to one another. It's also useful in gaining insight into the disparity between how platonic relationships between males and between females are viewed differently. With consideration of race, gender, and any other factors, it is also beneficial to be aware of how and when individuals decided to penetrate personal space and what it says about them and the way they perceive the penetrated individuals.
Spencer, and I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of information on the hypothesis and the experiment that we conducted. So, to test our hypothesis that gender is associated with the penetration of personal space, we chose to do an experiment where we carefully observed the penetration of personal space at the Memorial Union. This was on the Oregon State Campus University, so we were guaranteed to have a diverse group of people. We observed the people occupying the couch room, the foyer, and Java Stop. These are all very busy places on the Memorial Union area, so we were guaranteed to be able to test our experiment thoroughly. These three spaces are all very close in proximity, so we were able to observe people moving from one place to the next. Our rationale for observing students and faculty, rather than doing a scenario design survey, was that we wanted to understand the penetration of personal space with a natural and unaltered approach. There were several participants observed in the experiment because we observed the Memorial Union between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So during this window of time, many students were taking lunch breaks, coffee breaks, and other types of breaks, so the space was heavily occupied. We observed the people sitting alone, groups of females, groups of all males, and even co-ed groups. So it was hypothesized that gender is associated with the penetration of personal space. Our results showed that participants were not more likely to allow invasion of personal space if it was of the same sex. The results also revealed that female strangers were not more likely to sit close to female strangers rather than male strangers. However, our results did show that a person, regardless of their sex, was more likely to sit in the socio-consultative zone of a stranger, rather than sitting in a location where they felt pretty much exiled from the community all by themselves. So only one of approximately 15 groups, in groups meaning 2 or more people, we observed was a mixed race group. Many of the actions we observed were closely aligned with the U.S. norms of our culture, which we expected. Out of the 4 interpersonal distance zones listed on 139 of our text, a majority of the penetration took place in our participants' public zone. It was hypothesized that gender is associated with the penetration of personal space, and our results proved this theory to be true when we noticed that many of the all-girl groups were occupying the Memorial Union were sitting within the limits of each other's intimate zone. One group of 3 girls in particular was sitting at a table. They were all huddled around a computer, and they were definitely occupying each other's intimate zone. They were sitting very close in proximity and seemed very comfortable with this. Well, then we observed another group of 4 men. They were sitting in the couch room at the Memorial Union, and we noticed a larger distance in between each male. There was about 1 foot to 1.5 feet in between each male. They all had their own laptops, their own notebooks, and they seemed comfortable with each other. They just weren't sitting as close. So what we observed was that the females were less concerned about the invasion of their intimate zones, whereas the males were a lot more insistent on keeping their distance from one another. Another observation we made was that there were several male-female dyads in one another's intimate zones, showing signs of affection, but we observed no male-to-male dyads interacting closely or showing any affection. So, our study found that gender does play a heavy role in the penetration of male and female's personal space. People are not more likely to penetrate someone if they're of the same sex over the opposite sex, but male dyads did display the penetration of a separate zone than female dyads did. Female dyads proved to be much more intimate and invasive of one another's personal space than male dyads. Our hypothesis results were very characteristic of the U.S. norms. One of the limitations of this study, though, was that we didn't survey the people we observed. We would have better understood the members of the dyads' actions if we had conducted a large survey, but one of the strengths was that we were able to observe the race of the individuals. So more research would be beneficial to a similar study of gender and personal space penetration, because understanding this concept is really helpful and useful in our modern society.